I'm doing a great work and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop so I can come down to you? These are the words of Nehemiah as he built the walls fortifying Jerusalem over 2,000 years ago, as told in the book of Nehemiah in the Bible. Today we see, just as it was back then, that Jerusalem is the source of heavy conflict in the Middle East, with multiple groups of people vying for control over the ancient city, and global powers weighing in on the conflicts that have been brewing over centuries. Join us as we delve into the mystifying history of Jerusalem and Israel, exploring the ongoing struggles and complexities that have shaped this ancient area for over 2,000 years. Through riveting discussions, we unravel the mysteries surrounding Israel's pivotal role in global affairs, its significance in the Abrahamic faiths, and the intricate web of U.S. foreign policy in the broader Middle East. Get ready to expand your understanding of one of the most misunderstood regions on Earth, here on the Great Work Podcast. All right, welcome back to the Great Work Podcast. Today we have Rabbi Litvin, who you all know from TikTok. You're very funny, and you also know a lot and can provide a lot of historical and religious context to what's going on right now in Israel. So do you want to give a little bit about your background and who you are?
Sure. So everyone knows me. My name is Rabbi Litvin. I really got involved more online during COVID and have been more powerfully involved online since October 7th, especially on TikTok. The amount of just blatant misinformation and blood libels going on in the app is remarkable. And a student asked me, hey, could you answer this specific question? And the student didn't even realize that the lie that was being perpetrated was predicated on three other just ridiculous lies about Jewish people, about Israel, etc. And one thing led to another. I now get around on lives occasionally, especially when I'm working in my office. I'll have a live going in the background, and happy to be there to educate, to help others. I run the Jewish Student Center at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky, together with my wife, Shashi, and our 7 amazing kids. I live here in Lexington, Kentucky. I'm the second rabbi in Kentucky's history to be born in Kentucky and serve in Kentucky.
Wow.
And very proud to be an emissary of the Rebbe in central Kentucky. I also serve as the chairman for the Kentucky Jewish Council and as the lead educator right now for the Kentucky Educators for Holocaust Studies and a couple other organizations.
Wow. Well, thank you for coming on here. That's a lot of interesting things. So I love Lexington, Kentucky. I've been before, but not so much the religious education part as the fun part with the distilleries out there.
The
But
bourbon or the horses. That's the question when you say you're here for fun. Bourbon or horses?
Bourbon. But I want to go back for the horses, so we'll see. But
come by Caneland, yeah.
Yeah. So
I'll give you a hot tip on the third race.
Thank you. Well, so it's interesting. So what is it like being a rabbi in Kentucky? Are there a lot of Jewish people in Kentucky?
So, number one, when I first moved here, the president of the University of Kentucky asked, how many Jews do you need to move here? He was hoping I would say a large number and he could undersell me. And I said, 1.
Oh.
If I could move here and genuinely impact one person's spiritual relationship with God, my wife and I are happy to move here. There's way more than 1. So there's around 2,000 Jews in the Lexington greater area, and that includes many students at the University of Kentucky and faculty, etc. In Kentucky as a whole, I would guess there's about 15,000 Jews, but numbers vary depending who you ask.
Interesting. Okay, cool.
So Kentucky actually has a very rich Jewish history. There have been Jews in Kentucky.
Oh, wow.
When Daniel Boone first explored Kentucky, he was a land surveyor for a Jewish firm. And I'm pretty sure the first time anyone ever said, it's cool, I have a Jewish friend, was a senator from Kentucky. Henry Clay was friends with Benjamin Gratz, and he writes that in a letter, I have a Hebrew friend. And I'm pretty sure it's the first time in history that anyone ever said I had a Jewish friend.
Oh, wow. That's so
fun
interesting.
Historical note. Also, in the history of anti-Semitism in Kentucky, in America, Kentucky plays a central role. Because General Order 11, President Grant, as a general, evicting the Jews from the Department of Tennessee, which was Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi, happened. The largest Jewish communities were in Kentucky.
Oh, wow.
So this is the only place in America where Jews were expelled from.
I didn't even know that was part of U.S. history. Wow.
Yeah. And then, of course, Justice Brandeis began his life in Louisville, Kentucky. So one of the most prominent Jews in American history and then me. Those are the 2 big ones, Justice Brandeis and then me.
I love that.
Of prominent Jews in American history.
Definitely. So being a rabbi, you're an educator, right?
Mhm.
And so how did you decide you wanted to become a rabbi?
So I have wanted to be a rabbi since I was 6 years old. I could tell you the exact moment where I knew what I would do.
Cool.
A congregant, to make it very, very short, and I could expound on the story if you'd like, a congregant was in need, and I got to watch my father, who's a rabbi, and my mother be there for that congregant. And to me, it was a magic trick. They took someone who was broken and made them whole. And it's all I've ever wanted to do ever since.
That's so beautiful. If you want to expand on it, people
So
would
there
love
was
to hear the story.
as the rabbi's son, you're friends with everybody in synagogue. My dad once was giving a speech to a group of rabbis, and he said, 2 of my son's best friends passed away in the past month. And the room like goes silent. My 7-year-old son, he points at me. 2 of his best friends passed away. One was 87 and one was 92. Because I'm friends with all the old men who come to synagogue every morning for minyan, and one gives me a terrible hard candy, and another tells me the same joke every single morning. Literally the same joke every single morning. It was terrible. It wasn't a good joke to begin with, and he told it every single day. And one of the members of the congregation passed away, and maybe a month later, his wife came to our home. And my parents' home was always open to guests, to community members who were in need. And she knocks on the door. It's about 2 o'clock in the morning. She's pounding on the door. And my sister and I kind of peek downstairs to see what's going on. There seems to be something going on. And she says, my husband didn't come home from synagogue, and I don't know where he is. Now, today, I'm educated enough to understand the concepts like dementia. Back then, I understood crazy. I knew that word.
Mhm.
Again, it was the wrong word to use, but it's what I would call it. She was crazy. And she was yelling, he didn't come home from synagogue. I don't know what to do. Is he at a club? Is he having an affair? He wasn't. Like, even if he had been alive, that wasn't who he was.
Yeah.
And my parents invited her in, and my dad sat down with her. And I'm sitting on the steps watching as he talks about how much he loves Ben, her husband, in the first person. He's always there when we need a minion, and he's always there if I need help, and he's so good to the kids. And my mom made her a tea, and she must have called her daughter when she was in the kitchen, because her daughter showed up about an hour later. And then my dad moved from how much he loved him to how much he missed him. And she moved with him over the course of an hour. And when her daughter came and she was leaving, she was sad, but she was normal, to use a child's terms. Again, I'm a 6-year-old watching this. She went from a crazy person to a normal person. She just went through that full mode of thought. And to me, it was a magic trick. And my parents went to bed, and my sister went to bed, and at 6 a.m. my dad got up to pray, and I was still sitting there on the steps. And there hasn't been a single moment since where I've wanted to do anything but be a magician in people's hearts.
That is such a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that. And that's so cool that you have been able to achieve that, right?
I hope to do some small reflection of that in my daily life.
Yeah. So, what does the process look like to become a rabbi, maybe in general, and then what did you do specifically?
So, for the vast majority of rabbinical students, this was something they've been studying in yeshiva high schools, in yeshiva programs, in additional studies throughout. So, I went to a school that had Judaic studies. So, from my earliest education, I was already learning about Judaism. At young ages, I was in halacha bees and brachas bees, like a spelling bee, but for the laws of the Torah. Now there's the International Bible Challenge, which is a similar thing, knowledge of Judaism for kids. And the Chidon, which is the largest knowledge of God's commandments competition in the world. And my grandfather was one of the founders and built the religious high school in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So for high school, I moved to Pittsburgh, lived in my grandma's house, and went to that school. And then from there, studied in a few places, went to a summer program in Israel, and called my parents and said I'm staying. And ended up being in Israel for almost 5 years, where I went to rabbinical school. So rabbinical school starts at 7 in the morning and ends at 9:30 at night, with an hour off for lunch in the middle of the afternoon. And then after that, I interned as a rabbi, following another rabbi around and learning more practical after my degree. So I got the equivalent of a master's. And then I had 3 job opportunities. One was one that would have been financially rewarding, is a nice way to put it. That was based in New York. I had one that would have been very fun career-wise in Israel, and I was offered a job supervising kosher, which it was prestige-wise on the very bottom of that totem pole in Kentucky. And I called my mom and said, what should I do? I have these, 3 different opportunities. She said, well, what do you want to do long-term? I said, I want to be a force to support Judaism in Kentucky. She goes, well, then it's obvious which one you should take. And it was amazing advice. I never looked back, and I've been in Kentucky ever since.
That's so cool. So moving to Israel, I have a lot of questions I can ask about that. So Israel's largely, I think people get confused because Israel's largely it's a Jewish state that's secular, but allows for religious Jews to be religious Jews, right?
So it's the only Jewish majority state in the world.
Yes. Yes.
That's its uniqueness. It's the only Jewish majority state in the world.
Mhm.
So I was able to work with rabbis who worked for the government in Israel. That's the only
Mhm.
place in the world where you can do that today. Besides for the advantages of being in a Jewish majority state and the fact that there's a Jewish culture there. And so Mivtsayim was a very big part of my life when I was in school. Mivtsayim is reaching out and encouraging other people to do mitzvahs, whether it's the tefillin booths you might see or the Shabbos candle booths or menorahs before Hanukkah or announcing Rosh Hashanah's coming or Purim's coming, etc. Everyone's Jewish. And obviously not everyone. But if I would go to a mall, even in somewhere like New York, I might get 10% of people who are Jewish, 20. When I sit up at Mamila Mall, 90% of the people passing by are Jews. So the whole environment is different. And second of all, being in the Holy Land. So I first went to Israel as a teenager. My brother got engaged, and my dad realized that it was ever going to be a family vacation before we all get married and go live in our different corners of the world. Now was the time, and we all went on a family trip to Israel. And I fell in love the second I arrived. Well, I lost my glasses the second I arrived. I fell in love the second with a very blurry view of Israel. And I told my parents that I want to go to school. And my dad said, if you could figure out the finances, go with God. But just immediately, Jerusalem guides you to the Kotel, the whole city. It's not even, it doesn't make sense. But the whole city's kind of built towards the Temple Mount.
Mhm.
Tzfat, where I lived, which is my favorite city in the world, the spiritual city of air, it just feels like you're in a holy place. You wake up and you breathe in the air and you're like, I'm in a holy place. And it's entirely different to start off the day that way. To visit Hebron, the oldest Jewish city in the world, where to walk down the streets, there's nothing like it. I still, when I take students on trips with Taglit to Israel, they're like, we're going to go to the bars in Tiberias. And I'm like, cool, I'm going to go 100 yards that way to the tomb of Maimonides and the rabbis who wrote the Mishnah. And it's right there. It's right next to each other. They're on the boardwalk drinking beer, and I'm at the tomb of one of the greatest rabbis in history, surrounded by the rabbis who wrote the foundational books of Jewish law. And there's no hill to climb or gate to go through in between. The whole land is saturated with holiness. I say both to Jews and anyone else who follows a daughter faith of Judaism. Your faith changes once you've been to Israel. Israel's a remarkable experience that anyone that can should absolutely grab at every point they can. And if I wasn't doing what I do, invigorating Jewish communities and working with Jewish people to increase their relationship with God, I would unquestionably be in Israel.
Mhm. That's beautiful. I couldn't agree more. I had the chance to visit Israel in 2000. I was there New Year's Eve into 2017, and it completely changed my faith life too. And I'm not Jewish, I'm Christian, but seeing I couldn't agree with you more. I almost don't have the words. It changes you when you realize like the parts of the book that we grow up reading all are there, they're really
Yeah.
there. And you get to stand there, and it was a life-changing
Well, I
experience.
tell
And that's
non-Jews in Kentucky all the time, Bethlehem and Jerusalem and Beersheba are all fictional places till you've been there. It's in a book. Yeah, you can write a book about anything. You can write a book about Narnia or Westeros or Palestine, any fictional country. But once you've been in Yerushalayim, once you've been in Beersheba, once you've walked where Abraham was walking when God said, this is the land that I'm talking about, it brings an entirely new life to your faith.
totally. And I didn't get to visit Bethlehem, unfortunately, or the Jordan River, anything like that, because it was the trip was political in nature. It was done by APAC, but it was interesting. My mom or my dad's
You know, that just means you
mom.
have to go back, right?
Yeah, I know. I definitely have to go back. My dad's mom was a travel agent. She's really cool. She traveled the entire world, the entire Middle East and she was married, but she went alone to Iran and to Beirut and all of these places before they kind of fell. And she went to Israel, and before I went, she gave me all of her like documents from where she visited. And she told me, you're going to think it's all going to be like one hill, it's going to look, and they built churches on top of it. So it feels weird, which was true. But I don't know, the significance of building a church on top of a hillside also isn't lost on me. It was a really life-changing experience. And I wish more people had the chance to go and didn't just get into the political debate about like it doesn't exist, because that's pointless, and their lives could be so changed by it.
So I find that when you choose hate, it's a sad choice for you. It's a limiting choice. Choosing light, choosing love opens you up to so many more possibilities and avenues of expression and avenues of learning. So I absolutely understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, and isn't that an interesting thing? If, is it a chicken and egg problem of trying to get, the deeper you go into your faith, at least Christianity, and I believe Judaism too, because I know they're similar, the deeper you get in with your faith, the more you are apt to lean on forgiveness, but these people choosing hate are not that.
I mean, yeah, unless your faith is one that unfortunately betrays the basis of Abrahamic religions and chooses violence and chooses vengeance. But if you choose, put it this way, if you choose a faith well, then that faith benefits you in every other choice you make.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with C.S. Lewis's writings?
Yes. Yeah.
So C.S. Lewis wrote, "I know my faith exists like the sun, not because I see it, but because through it I see everything else."
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and being as Israel is the land of monotheistic faith, it's a big, big part of that.
Right. Well, maybe we can take a little veer off and talking about religions that choose hate and lean off of that forgiveness element. Do you want to go there a little bit?
If you'd like.
Yeah. So Judaism is the basis of both Christianity and Islam, right?
Yes.
Yes. And Christians worship the same Bible, but we added some stuff to it. And
Some alterations have been made, yeah.
a couple of small ones. And Islam, they have the Quran. They don't really study the Torah, the Bible, anything like that.
The best analogy that I've ever heard for the differences is the Torah is the original, the Bible is the sequel, the Quran is the remake, and then the Book of Mormon is fan fiction.
I love that.
So yeah, original, sequel, Hollywood remake, and then just fan fiction. Obviously that's not intended to put anyone's religion or holy book down, just a amusing anecdote for how the various books interact with one another.
Definitely. Yeah.
So you have a concept that is extremely present in both Judaism, in both the church and in Islam, which is replacement theology. Both religions said you have to embrace our religion. The obvious question, if you say you have to be a monotheist to a pagan, is there's been a monotheist group around for 1,000 years. When Islam was doing it, there have been 2 monotheistic religions around for 1,000 years. Why not choose one of those? If I'm going to switch from worshiping a rock to worshiping one God, why would I not join the dominant one? And the answer has to be either something's better about mine or something's worse about theirs. And unfortunately, many times, the choice has been there's something wrong with theirs. So you have early paintings by the church that have synagogue, the symbol of Judaism, on the left-hand side of God, the sinister side of God, as if there's something wrong with it. So number one, the desperate attempt, which sadly is still used today, to try to make both Judaism and the church daughter faiths of Judaism. So the concept of rabbinic Judaism or post-temple Judaism were entirely supremacist concepts trying to separate Jews from their history, that no one is the legitimate inheritor of temple Judaism. Temple Judaism doesn't exist. So, for example, they said that Jews only invented prayer after the temple was destroyed. Have you read the book of Daniel?
Yes.
Why does he go to jail?
Because he didn't pray.
Praying. Yeah. Because prayer has always existed in Judaism. Abraham prays, Moses prays, like it's dominant throughout the Torah. So the idea that Jews adopted matrilineal descent only after the temple was destroyed, when you have various examples of matrilineal descent literally written into the text of the Torah. Just all these ideas that there was one Judaism and then Judaism chapter 2, so that no one is Judaism chapter 1. It's a supremacist view by daughter faith to try to bring equality between the two. And the fact is that today, most sources in most forms of the church no longer embrace these hateful points of view. Academia certainly does, but they're morons. The fact is that no one who actually studies the texts still embraces them. And then you have Islam. When Islam comes around, there are 2 faiths that are already existing, especially where Islam came into being. The dominant monotheistic faith was Judaism. They quickly solved that by murdering all the Jews and sexually assaulting whatever women they allowed to survive. But when they arrived, Judaism was the dominant monotheistic faith. That is not to say they were a dominant faith in any way. They were still a small minority in the pagan tribes. But as far as monotheism was concerned, they were the dominant faith. So the question is, why shouldn't I join Judaism? And the answer is, we are the real Jews. Always good when someone says we're the real Jews. That's they're trustworthy.
At least favored, but favored people to deal with because they're so insane that it can be funny, but it's crazy.
So they say, well, it's not their fault, of course, but their book is corrupted. Our book is the only real one. And most importantly, if the church had added this in, maybe Islam wouldn't exist. But Islam was smart enough to be like, and we're the last word of God. No more words after us. See, they should have put that into Catholicism. They should have been like, and we're the last ones. They never thought to do that.
Well,
that's like a foundational part of Islam, is we're the last one. And this is the last time anyone's allowed to change any of the rules, starting now. Wait, we have one more rule change to make? Okay, starting now. We're the last word of God. No one else is ever allowed to change anything. But their claim was, as was the Christian claim, that we are the real covenant with God. So no one's denying the Jewish concept of a covenant. What Judaism is. Ethnicity is a bad modern term to describe Judaism.
Yeah.
Religion is a poor term to describe Judaism. These are all modern terms. Jews define themselves in two words, bris and am, a covenant, and more than a nation, almost a family. So Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, and Bris Avram, the covenant of Abraham. So that covenant, no monotheistic religion has ever denied. So what the Christians taught in the beginning was, well, God's fickle. He changes his mind. You can't really hold that guy to his word. So he told the Jews, you have a covenant. And then he said, change my mind. I'm really making a covenant with someone else. Islam had a much better version. Like, God doesn't change his mind. They're just wrong. We always had the covenant. Moses was Muslim, and Abraham was Muslim. They've always been Muslim. And the fact that no one's ever heard of us until today, they were undercover Muslims, but they've always been Muslim.
Yeah, that's the craziest concept for me to see in real time, because I can't believe that they believe it. But is that like their equivalent of the Trinity, Christianity, where no one really understands the concept of the Trinity and you kind of just have to accept it for what it is? Yeah, that's kind of what it is.
So those are the two ways of dealing with the fact that someone else existed that already had the same story. So all the stories in the Quran are based off Jewish stories. Mm-hmm. According to many historians, the reason they're based off the stories is he heard them from his wife, who was Jewish, when he was writing them down. He killed a large group of Jews and married their women. Many of his wives were women that he stole from Jewish families and forced to marry him. One of them particularly definitely had a hand in writing the Quran. How much of it was her responsibility, I don't know. But a lot of the old stories seem to come from Jewish sources, and seemingly came from one source who didn't have a Torah. She didn't have a Chumash. She's like, okay, so there was Moses. I think he was tall, and he brought 10 plagues to Egypt. It's kind of like when you watch one of the modern Moses stories, it feels like someone read the Wikipedia article once and then never came back to it. So like, were there rock monsters? I think there were rock monsters at one point. Yeah, that was the Noah version. But this idea of, like, you kind of know where someone was coming from. You clearly knew someone went to Sunday school. They heard all these stories. They never heard them again. They tried to write them down from memory. And then you end up with the Quran's version of Bible stories. So you have the story of Noah, but it's a little off. And the story of Abraham, but it's a little off. And the story of Isaac, well, not Isaac. Isaac's out. But the story of Moses, and it's a little off. And they say that we respect them all. They were all prophets because we're the last word. But you just don't know what they said. So that's like saying, I totally respect my wife's opinion. Now let me tell you what she thinks. Well, no, if you respect her opinion, she can tell us what she thinks. No, I ignore.
Yeah, because that's how the story claims that the Prophet Muhammad went to meditate silently in the mountains, and then he was given the Quran by God, right?
So the key difference between the central claim of all Abrahamic faiths and the central claim of Judaism is all other Abrahamic faiths come down to one person's personal revelation with God. God came to me and told me that you all should follow me. That's not Moses' claim. Moses' claim is, I brought you to a mountain and everyone saw God. 3.5 million people saw God. God spoke to all of you with me as your leader. So the way they were, and before that, you saw the sea split, all of you. And before that, you saw the 10 plagues, all of you. So when it says that the people trusted Moses, this is V'aminu b'Hashem of Moshe Avda. They believed in God and Moses, his servant. They believed in Moses as the servant of God, which really goes to the reason that we believe in any prophets in Judaism. The reason that we call Moses the father of prophets is because we only trust other prophets because Moses said if someone does A, B, C, and D, they're a prophet. And we saw Moses at Sinai. So everything comes back to the mass revelation at Sinai in Judaism. Without the mass revelation, you have nothing. So one of two things happened, in other words. One of two things happened, in other words. Either 3.5 million people saw God, or someone came along later and convinced an entire nation of people, by the way, your ancestors all saw God and no one ever told you. That's similar. The second one is similar to, maybe the greatest huckster in history. Your grandfather saw God and it just never came up at dinner. There was never an opening in the conversation for him to tell you.
Yeah.
Again, you have millions of Jews. All of your ancestors saw God and no one ever mentioned it. So the entire thing of dating back to Sinai and following both our patrilineal and matrilineal lineage, patrilineal through the tribe, and of course Judaism coming through the matrilineal lineage, is because those people were at Sinai. So my mother's at Sinai, saw God. She didn't hear from Moses. Moses didn't come back and go, so I spoke to the big man, here's what he said. She was there, she saw God. And that's the crux of Judaism, the mass revelation at Sinai.
That's the best way I've ever heard that explained. Thank you. So we're having... Okay, so if we're going to the point of the mass revelation at Sinai, my favorite part of that point, and this goes back to when I went to Israel, is if you go throughout Israel, Jewish archaeological sites are everywhere.
Except the Temple Mount. The Wakef does not allow any digging. The last person to dig for treasures in Temple Mount was Moshe Dayan, and whatever he found, he kept, because that was his thing. Do you know that Moshe Dayan was an earth thief? Yeah, he loved raiding archaeological sites.
Oh.
Little fun scoop about Moshe Dayan. He loved raiding archaeological sites. But the Wakef does not allow any digging on Temple Mount. Very odd that they wouldn't want one of their holy sites to be, looked at by experts, because they don't want the proof of the Jewish temple to be discussed at all.
Yeah.
It's worth noting UNESCO recognizes the Temple Mount as an Islamic holy site. UNESCO is supposed to be an educational organization. That's a fabrication of history. The Quran says that he went there because it was Suleiman's temple. Suleiman is King Solomon of the Jews. He also flew there on a donkey. But that's how the story goes. Mm-hmm. I can't. Who am I to deny the story of the guy who flew across the world on a donkey and built a mosque that didn't exist when his descendants got there later?
That part of the Quran is like an acid trip. I'm not as...
So far be it from me to judge holy texts, but that's the only place there aren't archaeological sites. Everywhere else, they are incredibly eager to study the land and routinely find more proof of Jewish history. It's worth noting a great deal of Jewish history used to be called a myth by academics. So Masada was a myth. You know that?
Yeah, I didn't know that, but I've been there.
For 1,500 years, Masada was a myth. It didn't happen. Then again, Troy was a myth until they found it. And Pompeii was a myth until they found it. Mm-hmm. But particularly in Jewish history, a great deal was considered myths until it was found. According to, I think it was Time magazine, the most important, one of their most important stories of the year was Maccabean swords being found in a cave in Israel. Someone stuck their hand in a hole in a cave in Israel and found swords in there. First of all, ick. If I'm in a cave, I'm not sticking my hand in holes. I don't understand the archaeological desire to stick your hand in holes in caves. Pass. Hard pass. But someone did it, and they found a bunch of swords that were almost perfectly preserved. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found by a child who was running around with goats. It's the easiest country in the world to have an archaeological find. And you have every year a story of a kid stumbling on a coin from the Maccabean era, from the Herodian era, etc. All the time. Just massive archaeological finds being found all the time.
So that's why it's so crazy to have the fights with people. Like, I remember, it's kind of embarrassing how little Israel before I went. I've talked about that before, so I won't go into it a ton. But I didn't know fully. They sat us down after however long the flight is from JFK to Tel Aviv. They sit us down. We've flown for that long, and they're like, put out in tape on the floor of the hotel, here's a map of Israel, and here's 67 borders. And I'm like, what is 67 borders? Like, that's how little I knew. And then we're driving the next day on the armistice line of 67, because I think there's a road on part of it or near it or something. What? They said, we're on a 67 border right now. So that's why when we talk about 67 borders, we can't go back because it would cut off this major highway. But then they point at this other...
So ignoring that, I mean, what early Israeli leaders called those borders were Holocaust borders.
Oh,
Those are
because
Holocaust borders. So it's worth noting that on October 7th, they got 80% of the way to the other 67 armistice line. They were 80% of the way to cutting Israel in half
mhm,
and having a terror network go straight from Hamas in the Judean West Bank and Judea and Samaria to Hamas in Gaza. Thank God they cut them off from that, but that was the attempt.
that yeah, I was just talking to someone who lives in the town that's the halfway point, that I guess in the plans they found they were trying to make it to his town and his village, and I'm blanking on the name of it, but I think it starts with, I don't remember. But like, it's crazy that they tried to do that, and defensible borders is such a huge part of this that I don't know
So
why
it's
we
worth
don't talk
noting they
about
weren't borders.
it. Mhm.
So unfortunately, the first thing that goes out the window when talking about Israel is accurate language. And then once you're not using accurate language, it's incredibly difficult to have an honest conversation using inaccurate language.
Mhm.
So, for example, 67 borders never existed. A
Mhm.
border has a specific definition. A border is a line between two countries, a mutual recognized line. And there are multiple places in the world where there is not a border. So, for example, in Africa, there's one small piece of land, it's one of my favorite African trivia facts, that no one claims. Because there were two different borders that were drawn in different years. One would give one country the waterway, one would give the other country the waterway, and both claimed the waterway, so neither claims this piece of land. Israel didn't have borders because Israel didn't have neighbors. Because in 1948, so really 1967 borders is because the the armistice line changed in 67. Syria still doesn't recognize that Israel exists.
Mhm.
One of the four countries to border Israel. Egypt, in 1967, did not recognize Israel had the right to exist. In fact, after they got their butts kicked again in 67, they met in Khartoum in Sudan, and they came out with the three no's. No negotiation, no peace, and no recognition.
Mhm.
Without recognition, you don't have borders.
Yes.
So this idea that we should go back to these lines are just where the fighting ended.
Right.
They weren't a border, because a border is a recognized line between two countries. Israel's first border was with Egypt, and we gave away, to have a border, we gave away economic independence. They gave away all the oil in Sinai for nothing in return. And this promise to create another Arab state within the lands that Israel owned, that was pledged to their destruction. In maybe besides the Versailles Treaty, the worst deal ever signed by any country ever. But the Versailles Treaty that Germany lost out on, they lost the war. Israel won the war and then signed that, which boggles the mind. Israel's the only one who apologizes for winning in the world.
I don't get it, but it's a whole other
Well, yeah, we
point.
can have a whole conversation about that.
Right.
But
But
Israel routinely wins and then apologizes for it. So the first border Israel ever had was with Egypt after the 70s. So there is no 67 border to go back to. Another misnomer is the idea of a two-state solution. There was a two-state solution. It was called the Peel recommendation. Then there was a second two-state solution. The two-state solution was in 1946, really, the UN had the partition plan. The Jews built a state. Whether they did it right or wrong, whether this was the best choice or that was the best choice, I mean, it was communist for the first 20 years, but the Jews built a state. There was now a thriving democracy in Israel with rights for all of its citizens, regardless of their religion, regardless of their persuasion, regardless of their point of view, their political party, etc. They built a thriving democracy. What we're talking about now is a second state solution, creating another state as a solution to the problem. But the concept of a two-state solution just entirely negates everything that Israel's accomplished in the last 75 years, as if you have two equal parties, each seeking to build a state. So the last two-state solution was in 19... After that, they've offered to create a second state. But the idea that it's a two-state solution immediately brings us to a drawing board as if one doesn't have more legitimacy. And one does. So, settlements are an impediment to peace. Everyone in the world will tell you that. Why? Because everyone in the world acknowledges that any Palestinian state, if we ever create a state called Palestine, it wouldn't allow any Jews. Otherwise, Jews living there wouldn't be a problem. No one ever says Arabs living in Akko are an impediment to peace. Because everyone assumes that when Israel continues, whenever this second state solution is made, Arabs will continue to live in Akko. But somehow, Jews living in Hebron, the oldest Jewish city in the world, is a problem because that land can't go to the Arabs if Jews are living there. Why not? Even in the greatest partition plans in history, when I say greatest, I don't mean most positive. I mean most overwhelming. There are still Muslims living in India. There are still Hindus living in Pakistan. They made major changes when Yugoslavia broke up. They don't move every single person. That's just not the way it works. So the only exception to that is that everyone accepts that the state of Palestine will be Judenfrei, will not allow a single Jew to live there. So you're asking me in 2020, would you support a second state solution? Would you support a state that, number one, gives you less defensible borders? Number two, the state is created by an enemy that has sworn for your demise. And number three, you're creating a state that doesn't allow Jews and it doesn't allow rights for women. It doesn't allow rights regardless of political persuasion. That's what you're asking me to support. So if you're asking me to support that, be honest about it. And I'm going to need a lot in return to support that. I'm not even saying I won't support it. But what am I getting in return? What assurances am I getting in return for this big ask? Because you're not asking for a two-state solution. That was what you asked in 1948, and Israel said yes. Now you're asking for a second state solution, and that comes with a whole bunch of stipulations.
Right. I think that the problem is that there's real educated people like you talking about this, and then there's people who read a couple biased articles who then want to say that who want to debate because they want to feel like they're smart. Because if they feel like they can score a point on someone like you, they're going to feel very smart, but they're very dumb, in my opinion, right? But they say these things like they act like we haven't progressed past 19. Of course, we've progressed past them. Like they'll say, "Well, right of return. Right of return for who?" Most people who were forced out of homes or chose to flee homes on their own volition or because they were encouraged to by their leaders, most of them are dead. It's been 75 years.
So this concept of an international right of return doesn't exist. Number one, in the international scale, is right of return or compensation. You get cut a check. Number two, that only applies to someone who they themselves were dispersed and who owned land. You don't get pain and suffering payments. So I understand you have a key. Do you have a deed? Otherwise, we change the locks. Tell your grandma to throw away the key. It doesn't work on a door anymore.
And they act like it would have been a Jew that moved into that home. It would have been an Arab. Arabs that
in the Arab areas almost entirely, yeah.
Yeah.
So the Arabs who didn't flee.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this concept that there's a right of return. Yes, Israel has a right of return. There's a very specific reason that Israel created that right. They created that right because when my family was trying to flee, they had nowhere to go. And now they're in Babi Yar. When my family was trying to flee, they had nowhere to go and they ended up in the gas chambers at Treblinka and of Auschwitz. That's why that law existed. Because when they needed somewhere to go, America shut the doors. Europe shut the doors. The idea from the river to the sea, Mayim, from the water to the water, Israel will be Arab, which is their rallying cry. Where are those Jews going? And they'll say, well, other countries will take them in. Like when? Like when? So if you want to say that America is going to double the number of refugees they take in, and Europe will double the number of refugees they take in, and they'll both take in Jews, that gets 1 million Jews housed. The Arab world's not taking them in. Africa's not taking them in. They're hunting down Jews in Russian airports today. So that conveniently leaves you with 6 million Jews with nowhere to go. Been there, done that, not willing to do it again. But that's the request you're making. So for example, a precondition of a second state solution would have to be a public, complete absolution of any claim to the land that Israel is on. For now and forever, I give up any claim to that land. So the idea of a right of return to that land is laughable. No, you're giving up claim to that land. That's part of the deal. We're giving up our claim to the land we're giving you as a gift out of mercy, and you have to give up claim to land. If you don't, there's nothing to talk about anymore. The Lamaya has to end before any peace deal can start. And I said this on TikTok before, if you had fought better, you could have set the terms. But you didn't. You got beat again and again and again. And you don't get to set the terms now. That's not the way the game works. Now, in my opinion, God made a miracle. Having studied all three wars extensively, I don't see a way that 73 ended how it did. I don't see a way 67 ended how it did. I don't see a way, again, rationally, militarily, 48 ended how it did. You had at one point a group in Israel called the New Historians. They were openly revisionist historians. So they said, here's what happened. In 1948, Israel won a crazy victory. And we put it up to chance. Wow, what a weird instance where Israel managed to pull off a victory somehow. And then they pulled off even greater odds in 67. There was exactly one person on the international stage who predicted a victory for Israel in 1960. And Israel wasn't it. Israel was digging mass graves on the hillside of Jerusalem expecting that if anyone survived, they'd be burying half the country. The only person that was openly calling for a victory was the Lubavitch Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who was telling college students, stay in Israel. It's going to be okay. The front page of Israeli papers were printing this rabbi's words from Brooklyn. He said, it's going to be fine. We're all going to win. It's going to be cool. So 1967 happens. The war happens. You need to believe one of three things now. One, God made a miracle, and we have a responsibility to hold on to that land. Okay? Number two, God made a miracle, and we have a responsibility to use that land to create peace. So those are the two political parties in Israel. Number three, God didn't make a miracle, because I don't believe in miracles or I don't believe in whatever, in which case my math was wrong. Because the question was 6 minus 1 equals 5. That's the rational answer. However, it was 6 minus 1 equals 1, and the 6 are gone. Israel won.
Mm-hmm.
So either it was a miracle, or my math was wrong, and really, Israel was always stronger, which means Israel must have been the aggressor, which means Israel is responsible for all evil in the world, because it doesn't make sense to me that something miraculous happened here. So that's where you get the entire Nakba narrative, the entire concept of the new historians, were people who... David Ben-Gurion famously said, to be a realist in Israel, you have to believe in miracles. The new historians were a rejection of that. We don't want to be realists, and we don't want to believe in miracles. So we have to fabricate a history in which the math works out that there wasn't a miracle, because we've taken miracle off the table. So something else has to change. We need to fudge the numbers, because the current math equals miracle, and we don't want that. So it's a rejection of, again, Ben-Gurion was not a religious person, but as Ben-Gurion said, in order to be a realist in Israel, one has to believe in miracles. Golda Meir in 1960, you had Arik Sharon wanting to do an incredibly daring move and invade Egypt, and she said no. And Sharon asked, if there's a rabbi in New York who will guarantee that I come back safely, can I go? And she said, yeah, absolutely. She openly said she didn't like religious people, but she'd only take a rabbi's word, because it's Israel. Because miracles happen here. We're in the miracle business. And everyone acknowledges it, religious or not. There's a famous interview with a Hamas member who says it's like God moves the rockets. Yeah, it's a lot like that. So there are technological miracles like the Iron Dome and like David's sling. But when I was a kid, we had Saddam Hussein firing Scuds at Israel. Every single Israeli child walked around with a gas mask, waiting for the mustard gas to arrive. And not only did he never use a chemical payload, but the rockets didn't kill anyone. The largest rockets ever fired at Israel didn't kill anyone. And there are crazy stories about families going to their bomb shelter and their house getting hit, or the family deciding to stay in the house and their bomb shelter getting hit. There's one story that still blows my mind to this day of a family gathering in one room in their house, the most central room in their house, and there's one comfortable chair. And the grandfather said, I'm not going to sit down because my granddaughter's pregnant. And the pregnant woman said, I'm not going to sit down because you're old. You get the chair. And as they stood there arguing, a 6-foot piece of shrapnel came through the wall into the chair, the empty chair. So again, you either have to say miracle or no, Scuds aren't really powerful rockets. Saddam was just showing off. It didn't really mean... So you have to deny reality, because a realist has to believe in miracles. And that's where you get back to where this war on God, where this war on Abrahamic faiths leads you to be deluded, because it clearly plays in here. Ben-Gurion didn't have another answer for it. Golda Meir didn't have another answer for it. In America, they didn't have another answer for it. So if you don't have another answer, you either have to say all the information I have that I've seen with my own eyes is a lie, or there's something else at play here. So I'm just incredibly grateful that I'm able to recognize that God's at play here. Otherwise, I also have to make up a story to make it work. Which, again, gets back to when you're having conversations on TikTok, the easiest thing is to ask for proof. Because their narratives don't have proof, because proof makes you a realist, and a realist makes you believe in miracles. So the classic Pali argument is to yell 3 things at once, so that even if they demolish one of those 3 things, you still have 2 arguments. And the reason that, oh, wow, Rabbi, it's so amazing, I said, I just slowed him down. I slowed him at the first leg of his argument and proved that was false. Then he put a second leg, and I proved that was false. And then when I proved the same third one that you would have disproved, he had nothing left because I slowed him down. Because I pointed out that the first 2 things are just not based on anything at all. So that's always the key, is to bring honesty, bring accuracy into the conversation, bring realism into the conversation. Because again, they have to deny being that reality for their argument to hold any water.
I've always thought that they wouldn't accept a deal for peace because of, my thought this whole time, and I studied this conflict in college too, so this has been my thought for a while, has always been just, Jews were dhimmis throughout the Ottoman Empire. Then they go through a 30, 40-year period where all of a sudden the third-class citizens now have equal rights and a claim to statehood. They're not going to take that. But also, I think the better claim is the one you just made, where you can't deny that miracles are taking place, and the fact that those miracles are taking place for the Jews kind of disproves their faith in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So again, it is a religious war. If you ask anyone honestly, who's willing to be honest and ask if the people of Israel were Arabs, would this war be going, or Muslims, would this war be going on? The answer is no, because they have foundational belief that any land that was once ruled by the Caliph has to be ruled by the Caliph again, which, by the way, includes large parts of Europe and all of North Africa. The idea that Nasser was fighting for a Palestinian state is a lie.
Yeah.
And anyone that's ever read a single history book knows it. The idea that Hafez al-Assad was fighting for a Palestinian state. The idea that the King of Jordan, who, when he wasn't warring with Israel, was warring with Black September, which was a Pali terrorist group. He wasn't fighting for a Palestinian state. They were fighting for their dominion over the area. I was recently at an event in Washington. Very important historical fact to know. I am 10 inches taller than the King of Jordan. I think it's critically important that everybody know this. I don't know why I feel that, but it's very important people know this. So I was watching him give a speech, I imagine standing on a milk crate, and he said that my father loved peace. And it took every ounce of my restraint not to call out. He loved peace so much, he started 5 wars so he could make peace afterwards. Because he just loved making peace. So he made peace in 67 after he got his butt handed to him. And in 73 after he got, and then, with the terrorists. And he kept on, making peace from the wars he started. But again, the King of Jordan's grandfather was killed in Jerusalem by a terrorist. His father was almost killed by a terrorist in Jerusalem, visiting Temple Mount. So the idea that these countries were trying to create a new Arab state, they were trying to create a pan-Arab state. Syria and Egypt considered themselves one country for a long time, with a problem in the middle.
Yeah.
A mutual problem. Israel is our misfortune. It's just a modern version of the same Nazi tagline. The Jews are our misfortune. Now, here's the problem. I was just talking to someone yesterday about why does it seem that things get worse when there's anti-Semitism? And I said the easiest thing to do is this example. If you have potholes, and you say Jews cause the potholes, and you attack the Jews, do you know what happens? The potholes get worse because you didn't do anything to address them. Because, and this is going to shock everyone, the Jews didn't cause the potholes. Erosion caused the potholes. So you have, for example, in the German economy was tanking. And the entire government effort was, it's the Jews' fault. And somehow, harassing Jews didn't fix the economy. Because that wasn't the problem. You have horrible problems in the Arab world. And their leaders, their imams, and the political activists are all saying, well, Israel is the reason we have problems. So they spend all their money. I mean, the PLO spends a third of their budget paying for terrorism. Abu Mazen, the head of the PLO, the official peace partner recognized by America, is paying the terrorists who committed the atrocity of October 7th. It's a third of his budget. It's dumb to spend a third of your budget on anything. In America, we spend nearly that much on old people. They spend it on terrorism because that's where their emphasis is.
Mm-hmm.
And what you end up with is less money for social services. So you don't have care for the elderly. In America, we spend that money on safety net programs so that people are able to eat and people don't have food insecurities. Although we haven't solved that problem, obviously, in America. They're spending that money on killing Jews. So then people go hungry because there's only so much money. So it's not just that governments that are driven by anti-Semitism are bad governments. It's being driven by anti-Semitism makes them worse governments. If Abu Mazen wasn't obsessed with killing Jews, he'd be a better leader. He'd still be a thief. He'd still be stealing money left and right. But he'd just have more money to steal and therefore more money to also give out if he wasn't spending a third of his budget on trying to kill Jews, which, by the way, and not getting banged for his buck. They're still losing.
That's the part I don't understand. It doesn't help their cause at all.
So insanity is trying the same thing again and again, expecting different results. Now, the problem is that America and the West are allowing them to be insane. So it was a vile Western idea to allow the PLO back into Israel, to allow Yasser Arafat, a man who dedicated his life to killing Jews, to become a legitimate political leader. They gave him the Nobel Peace Prize. He then went to the UN with a gun on his hip, the first person to ever do that, and continued his claim that he was going to kill every Jew in Israel. and then launched an intifada trying to do so. He failed miserably. His only claim to legitimacy is the fact that he once stood on a stage with Arafat. So first of all, Arafat's daughter, who isn't his daughter, Arafat had a beard marriage for public consumption, but his daughter has $6 billion.
And lives in Paris.
She's never had a job.
Yeah.
She lives in Paris. She doesn't live in the West Bank. If she did, Abu Mazen would have to kill her, how their government functions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Nasser and Sadat paid their families so little money that Nasser's son-in-law was a spy for Israel for money. He's one of the highest paid spies in the history of the world. So as long as you're going to spend your money on trying to kill Jews, you will always have, number one, the corruption, number two, the utter devastation of your own people, because that money is needed for things. It's aid money. They're not making that money. It's all aid money that they're spending.
Yeah. Well, it's a complicated problem that they don't seem dedicated to solving.
I think that we're the ones that make it complicated.
Yeah.
If America wanted to solve this, it would be solved, but it would have to start with being honest.
It's a problem.
Yeah. The magic of the Abraham Accords. This incredible deal. By the way, the greatest step to world peace in your lifetime.
I agree. I'm a massive fan. I've read every think piece there is on it. Jared Kushner's book. I am such a massive fan of it.
So it was this simple.
Mm-hmm.
I can't afford Jared's book, so I haven't read it yet, but I've read a lot of pieces online. It was this simple. They sat the parties down and said, what do you want? What are you looking for here? And then just listened to the end of that sentence, which something America had never done before. America had always come with a prepackaged solution saying this is the solution, and either Israel was dumb enough to give in, and the Arabs said no, or Israel said, we just tried that and it didn't work, and America's like, oh, why don't you want peace? But the first time they were like, hey guys, what is it you want? The State Department has always said that all the Arabs want is to kill Jews, which is an incredibly bigoted point of view to have. But it is a foundational belief in the State Department. But it turns out what Saudi Arabia wanted was the ability to secure their borders. What the UAE wanted was the ability to secure their borders. What Morocco wanted was claims to some land that they felt they had a claim to. And Sudan wanted to be off the terror list. It turns out their first concern wasn't kill the Jews, and so they're able to benefit their country. Because when you take that concern off the table, it opens up the world of possibility to you. And it's tragic that Abu Mazen keeps choosing it, and as long as we allow Hamas to stay in power, they will keep choosing that. And their citizens will continue to suffer.
Yeah, that's really all there is to it. I think this is a good place to end it. Is there anything else you want to promote?
You can find me across social media at @BluegrassRabbi. Come along for the ride. It's fun. It's funny, as you said. I feel if we don't laugh, we're going to cry. But be happy to come on and do this again sometime.
Definitely. Everything to find Rabbi Litvin will be linked in the description. So everyone be sure to check that out. Thank you so much again. I'll stop.
My pleasure, man. And I'll see you on TikTok.
Yeah.